Forget about Bash and Whirlwind, I got something way better for you, the Quake Rend Rupture Blade Barbarian. Using the secret Thorn's Barbarian technique of stacking earthquakes to have your bleed get bigger and bigger and multiplicative increase your damage by 100%. While you're schnazzling around with your Rend and jumping from pack to pack, and in between with a Rupture, you're doing big bleed explosions that overwhelm everyone and reset all of your cooldowns instantly so you can keep jumping from pack to pack and just bunny hop speedrunning through those tier 101 dungeons. And if you're fighting a boss, you're essentially going to make as many earthquakes as possible while just standing in front of them, zip, 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 with your Rend. And every 13 seconds, you can do a huge hundreds of millions Rupture explosion. And the best part is it works with basic gear very well already. And if you have Ubers, you can still tremendously improve it. Let me explain the gameplay loop and then go down on skills, Paragon, gear, the whole package. Step 1 will always be leaping in, because leap gives you your berserking, that is more movement speed and damage, fury generation, damage reduction and everything, and it creates this earthquake. That's already a 10% damage multiplier. The interesting part is that the earthquake actually does stack with your bleeding effect. So the actual earthquake spikes from the leap and also from your stomp, which is a stun, and yes, it stuns the enemy for 4 seconds, creates even more bleed. Which means that you're essentially going to be leaping in, stunning everyone, and then you're just going to rend away and see your bleed stack up, stack up, stack up. Then you jump again. You can shout for even more damage multipliers, jump again, stomp, jump again, shout, jump again. And whenever your Rupture has a golden border around it, you can go for the millions of damage super explosion Rupture. And the fun part is that skewering the enemy will overpower, and that overpower skewer will straight away always trigger gushing wounds and shower everyone in an explosion of blood, bleeding them even harder. And that blood explosion with the Rage of Harrogate then actually reduces all your cooldowns tremendously. With the Warcry Shout, you're increasing your damage, but also getting damage reduction and heal, whereas the Rallying Cry provides Fortify and is your source of unstoppable if you get into any iffy situations. And the fun part is that every leap into a ground stomp instantly has to do another leap. And that's straight away standing in 3 earthquakes without doing anything bonus. That's 30% bonus damage. Then you leap again, yell, leap again, yell, leap again. And suddenly we're standing in up to 6 goddamn earthquakes as quick as possible. The highest I've yet gotten stacked up against a boss is 10. One time was 11 when all my cooldowns work perfect. And that is a 110% multiplicative bonus damage. With the Rumble Glyph, that gives you 10% more for every earthquake you're standing in. And the earthquakes are actually reducing the damage you're taking by 38%. Yes. Oh, and they increase your damage also by 25% multiplicative. It works so well together. Do the skills, and this can actually be played from level 1 on. We're beginning with Flay into Enhanced Flay, but we're not going to be using that. It's only useful for leveling. Then all the points in Rend, and we're going to have Rend extend vulnerable, plus Rend actually give us 25% multiplicative bonus damage versus vulnerable targets. Into the Ground Stomp, but then increase the duration of Ground Stomp, and on top of that have Ground Stomp provide you with Fury, that you're actually never running out of Fury. We're getting as many points as possible into Imposing Presence, and yes, we have Imposing Presence Tempers too for the huge bonus life, and then damage reduction from elites. There's the Rallying Cry into Enhanced Rallying Cry for Unstoppable, plus then Rallying Cry actually providing us with a Fortify. We're not taking a single point in Outburst, but we do have a temper for Tough as Nails, as we do have a bit of Thorns, and our Thorns are essentially giving us even more bleed. It doesn't hurt to have. Now, we don't have a single point in Warcry because we're playing the Harlequin Crest. If you don't have a Harlequin Crest, you're going to rip 1 point out of Prolific Fury to put that actually into the Warcry. That being said, Harlequin Crest is really good. And we have our shouts last longer, heal us, and also give us more damage reduction, and that's why you want to rotate your shouts always after another and never do them together. Plus our leap with 1 point into leap having a cooldown reduction when it doesn't hit anyone, and then 40 fury as well, which gives us 40 fury every 4 seconds against a boss and keeps us completely topped up perfectly together with a ground stomp. More damage reduction while berserking into battle fervor when a brawling skill damages someone, and that would be leap. Brawling skill every 4 seconds. We enhance the duration of battle fervor by another 1 second over the Paragon board. That means every 4 seconds we leap, berserk, leap, berserk, leap, berserk, continuous berserking, for the bonus of fury generation as well. 3 points into Pit Fighter for the damage reduction from distant and the bonus damage to close, with a 1 point into Hamstring, and then 3 points into Cut to the Bone. The bonus bleeding to make your bleeding effect stronger against vulnerable opponents, and that's why we kind of want Cut to the Bone on the amulet as well to get even more out of it. we have Rupture. And again, Rupture has a forced overpower. So when Rupture points in, it forces an overpower, which is really interesting. Then you're ripping the blade out, and the blade ripping out does more damage the more strength you have. So for every 50 strength is increased by 10%, and we're currently sitting at 300% increase. And I could bring my strength probably up to 2,000 with some greater affixes. Very important. Lastly, Warrior's Rupture, get another 40% attack speed as you rip it out. It's pretty good. We're using Rupture against bosses every 13 seconds. So every 13 seconds for 5 seconds, we're getting bonus attack speed. That's pretty decent. 1 single point into the thick skin for the fortifiers, we take damage, and then counter offensive for more damage multiplicative as we have more fortify, and heavy handed for 15% increased critical strike damage with two-handed weapons. And since our gushing wounds is all scaling with critical strike and critical strike chance, that's what you have. The first part is the chance to trigger is equal to your critical strike chance, and then you're dealing bonus bleed amount damage of 140x of your critical strike damage bonus. More critical strike damage bonus, more bleed, more gushing wounds. But if you're overpowering a bleeding enemy, you create an explosion that inflicts even more bleeding damage. And that explosion is essentially force being triggered by Rupture. And as you're pushing through the dungeon and you then Rupture, explosion, cooldown reset, fantastic. Now I'll show you the good gear, but provide you with an alternative for every piece that we're having. The most important thing are your weapons, because you need to temper earthquake duration on it. The longer your earthquakes are, the longer you can stand in them, the more damage you get multiplicative. And you do want critical strike damage on every single weapon. Maximum life, greater affix is what I mostly aim for. Then the second temper would be critical strike damage. That is needed to absolutely max out the build. So if you want to go super crazy with it, and for this, you would have to have a rogue. But you don't need the critical strike damage tempers to make it work. Before, I played it with damage while berserking. And even with all the damage while berserking tempers, I was easily able to clear that pit 101. Just slower. And the trend continues on my one-handed weapons. They should be swords for the intrinsic critical strike damage. I only had hammers though because of the earthquake duration, and this one even has damage while berserking and the critical strike damage. We'll get to while damage while berserking actually does work nicely. On your first two-handed weapon you play wanton Rupture. Your Rupture does not remove the bleeding damage from enemies, because otherwise it would usually rip that out of them. Now every 13 seconds, when you get a golden border and a slight ching sound effect, you just simply can do it and keep the bleed up. And that is perfect versus bosses. Your 100 weapons are running whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, inflict 30% of the base damage dealt as additional bleeding damage. And that is all the earth spikes that every single earthquake is outputting that's being put below your opponents. The second weapon that also has crit damage, earthquake duration, and critical strike damage is running critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed, so you can attack even faster with a Rend to inflict even more bleed. And lastly, we're playing the Groundfather because the Groundfather just brings me from 1,800% crit to 3,000% crit. Now again, we tried to build completely without Grandfather, and it was just smoothly streamlined flying through. And the Grandfather has one problem. It doesn't have the earthquake duration temper going on. You're missing out on 126% potential earthquake duration, which allows you to almost go up to 15 and beyond earthquakes. Therefore, it's not super hurtful to actually not have the Grandfather. You can do the same with a sword. And the very good thing is that you get another bonus aspect, and you can move the earthquake aspect, which allows your ground stomp to make earth spikes to go on that sword. And then you'll get a 50% damage multiplier there as well. So more damage multipliers from the quakes below you, and the bigger damage multiplier from actually standing in an earthquake as well, and double of that. So it's not really bad to actually run this. Don't worry, the planner will have both versions in the description below with the alternative aspect. Your first ring needs to run crit chance. Yes, crit chance is mandatory and so important. Attack speed and strength. Then I have damage to close enemies here, or damage to berserking, critical strike damage if possible. And then you need resource cost reduction, not resource generation, because we're currently playing the Ring of Starless Skies, which will reduce the cost of my primary ability. Because we're currently playing the Ring of Starless Skies, and that will reduce the resource cost of our Rend. Rend is currently sitting at a 35%, and you're cutting that down to 17, which allows you, with the Fury generation and Fury per second you're having, to essentially never run out of resource. But you have a tons of attack speed, so sometimes you might, and that's why you were having the leap and the stomp happening to just soak us back up again. That being said, if you don't have the Ring of Starless Sky, it's going to be resource cost reduction and resource cost reduction tempering plus resource cost reduction tempering. And the thing about the Ring of Starless Sky is it has only a 7% critical strike chance, while my ring here is up to 11% with the attack speed as well. So I could be getting a greater affix attack speed on this one too, even more critical strike damage tempering, everything that I'm missing with the Ring of Starless Skies. Yes, it's giving me that 50% multiplicative bonus damage. That being said though, the other ring wouldn't be sadder and I would get another aspect that we could actually be using. Now the amulet has to play currently the aspect of Volcatis for the insane amount of damage reduction. It's another 38% as we're standing in earthquakes, plus the leap is actually making earthquakes too that do more spikes, and these spikes are doing significant amount of damage. Right now on the amulet, we're playing a lucky hit to vulnerable. That allows us to keep our vulnerable up 100%, especially with the Rend actually extending the duration of vulnerable. So we essentially just need to vulnerable one single time and then it's up forever. Attack speed crit chance perfect. I would probably drop the attack speed here or the lucky hit vulnerable and move it to the second ring, because what you really want there is ranks into cut to the bone for just the insane amount of bleeding effect increase. Now we sadly don't have that, so we're tempering imposing presence for even more life and then resource generation / going down on resource cost reduction. The boots are running damaging an enemy with kick or ground storm resets leap's cooldown, so we can leap even more. We have fury per second, and you really do want that fury per second to never run out of fury, and resistance to all elements. That resistance to all elements could also be shadow resistance, because right now that's why we're getting resistances. You look at my rings and they all have different gems in them: red, topaz, and emerald. So that's how we're kind of trying to get 100% resistance. Actually, my shadow resistance is only at 40% right now, and I'm still surviving everything. Movement speed and tough as nails tempering, because a little bit of thorns into a little bit of more damage. Why wouldn't we? The pants are running undying to keep us topped up and healthy the whole time, plus another imposing presence tempering for more life multiplicative, and then a lucky hit chance to immobilize, freeze, stun, slow, anything like that, with applying essentially bonus stagger. You want any kind of resistance like cold resistance. Technically you could go for any resistance, but then you should be somewhere too low. Maximum life and armor is important to actually have us armored out. As you can see, we're at 9,880 currently with one single armor roll. The glove should be having ranks into Rend, because that can go up to +8, because Rend is +4 standard. Critical strike chance and attack speed mandatory. Then I have damage while berserking on it. Yes, this could be critical strike damage, but it's still damage while berserking and it's working. Another lucky hit chance to immobilize, freeze, or stun. I think I would actually prefer freeze here, but I just 2 times rolled immobilize at this point. It is what it is. And currently ground storm creates those earthquakes, and that is the damage multiplier. Now, as the chest, we're playing the Rage of Harrogeth, which gives us more critical strike chance against elites, cool, thorns, physical damage, and damage reduction from bleeding enemies. Since everything always bleeds, it's always damage reduction, and then if we inflict bleeding on an enemy, we have a 40% chance to reduce all cooldowns. And that works fantastic on all our skills, especially with that overpowered bleed explosion, bloop, just resetting our cooldown straight away. And lastly, the Harlequin Crest. The cooldown reduction is great, but the resource generation is actually what we're more looking here for, because more resource generation is more fury at any given point. 22.5% perfectly synergizes with the 10 fury per second already, because it's actually not 10 fury per second, it's 10 fury per second times 22.5% times the 18% resource generation we have anyways, or the other resource generation that we have on the rings currently, just making this not just simply be 14 fury per, just not simply making this 10 fury per second. Now, alternative to the Harlequin Crest, you could play the Iron Blood aspect, which gives you 5% damage reduction for each nearby bleeding enemy up to 25% maximum. Or you could be moving the aspect of Volcatis actually over to your helmet to then get the damaging aspect from the earthquake on your amulet for more damage. And we have the slot for another aspect. Again, both versions in the description below, with Ubers and without Ubers. Paragon board, and this one gotta make you juicy. We're going over the left side for bonus armor because I simply needed it. If you have an item with a lot of armor, you can go over the right side instead. We want all the max life nodes possible. Then we're activating Exploit here for the bonus vulnerable damage. And it's in the beginning board because it's so easy to pick up every single dexterity without having to go weird ways. Keep in mind, this needs to be level 21 for the maximum bonus damage of vulnerable you can get. This will be clear to you in a second. Then we're going upwards into the Bonebreaker board. Ignore the legendary glyph, pick up the 8% max life and also damage reduction while healthy. Together with a Wrath, for every 5 dex we get more critical strike damage, and well, we get 44 out of 25. Fantastic. Also want this level 21 as soon as possible. into the Decimator board. For each time you make an enemy vulnerable, your damage is increased by 10% for 5 seconds. If we're overpowering a vulnerable enemy, it gets another 10%. Interesting enough, we do overpower enemies with the Rupture, Skewer, Pull Out. 5 seconds more damage. In this board, we can get damage reduction from vulnerable enemies and 20% bonus vulnerable damage. Plus, we're playing the ambidextrous glyph to 125 bonus to all magic nodes. Double, 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 double. Yep. Just getting everything bigger. Now we're going out on the bottom here to pick up another 20% vulnerable damage and, well, some armor, but mostly the vulnerable damage. This leads us downwards into the Carnage board. While Berserking critical strikes increase your attack speed up to 16%, more attack speed, more bleed, more Berserking, more fun. We go for a lot of Berserking damage here. Berserking damage and damage reduction from close enemies, plus the Martial Glyph, which has our shouts reduce the cooldowns 4 more leaves, and also boosts all the magic nodes here for even more damage reduction. Now you could go out to the left first, but that's wrong. You go to the bottom. And on the bottom we have Blood Rage. And Blood Rage gives us a 30% bonus according to how much Berserking damage we have. If you have more Berserking damage tempers, you can invest these points. You don't have to invest them. You could rather take these points and splurge them into more vulnerable damage, get more max life, or get even more vulnerable damage here. These points are useless in case you don't have the critical strike damage tempers. Now in the Blood Rage board, we're activating Earthquake, Rumble. For every 5 strength, we get even more Earthquake damage. More Earthquake damage is nice as we're having like 20 Earthquakes stacking on top of each other, and you deal 10% increased damage to bosses and crowd controlled enemies for each active Earthquake. Getting damage to bleeding enemies, and damage reduction from bleeding enemies. Even better, and as you can see, every single rare node is activated due to the Paragon board changes. As you're leaving out, I took a little bit more damage while Berserking because I didn't have enough, and a slight increase in Berserking duration to have the perfect 4 seconds kind of going on. Then to the left into the Flawless Technique board, and here we get damage reduction from close enemies together with bonus damage while Berserking, and I really needed this to actually push me further. Again, the Ire Glyph might not be needed for you because you have the Berserking tempers. And you could, for example, consider Territorial for damage reduction from close. Or even Bloodfeeder, which gives you more critical strike chance against bleeding enemies. There are alternative options. Lastly, we're going to move up to the Carnage board and go to the left. And this is where we're taking Hemorrhage. Your bleeding damage is increased by 15% of your vulnerable damage bonus. Yes, there's a ratio of 10 to 1 you're trying to hit, meaning like 3,000 critical strike damage to 300% vulnerable damage. Optimal endgame would be 5,000 crit damage to 500 vulnerable damage. If that 10 to 1 fits, that's quite nice, and you can adapt easily with the gems in your gear. So put in vulnerable gems if you need more vulnerable, or put in critical strike if you need more critical strike. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope I could show you something incredible fun to play. Drop in the description below which Barbarian you prefer and why you're actually playing that. If you're rather looking forward to maybe rocking a rogue that can demolish anything, enjoy clearing the pits faster than ever. Thank you for watching and have a great, good day.